Okay, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a moment. We're going to let a few folks trickle in and then we'll get started. Okay, as folks continue to trickle in, I'll go ahead and get a few housekeeping notes out of the way. Welcome, I'm Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PMP Live. Okay, as folks continue to trickle in, folks continue to trickle in. I apologize about that. I think I've got it settled. Can everybody hear me okay? I apologize about that. I think I've got it. There's an echo. Settled. Can everybody hear me okay? From YouTube. I apologize about that. And I've taken us off YouTube, so hopefully that won't happen again. My apologies. At any point during the event, you can click on the chat where I'll be putting a link to purchase Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Brian Klaas grew up in Minnesota, earned his PhD at Oxford, and is now a professor of global politics at University College London. He is also a weekly columnist for the Washington Post and host of the award-winning Power Corrupts podcast. Klaas has conducted field research across the globe, interviewing despots, CEOs, torture victims, dissidents, cult leaders, criminals, and everyday power abusers. He has also advised major politicians and organizations, including NATO, the European Union, and Amnesty International. Klaas will be in conversation with Marielle Trump. She's the author of the international #1 bestseller, Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, and New York Times bestseller, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. She holds a PhD from the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies at Adelphi University and has taught graduate courses in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology. I'm going to pass the screen on to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you, Politics and Prose, and everybody who's attending tonight. It's so great to be here with Brian. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it's my pleasure. As I said to you earlier, I think your new book is brilliant. And, before we start, I just want to say that, not only is it brilliant, it's incredibly well observed, it's well researched, it's fascinating, compelling, and it's funny, which is not something you would expect necessarily from a book about despots. But, more importantly for our purposes, I think, is that it's also in the current context, certainly of the American political crisis, it's really timely. So I was wondering, just sort of out of the gate, what prompted you to start writing this, researching and writing this book?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Politics and Prose. So basically, I started my career studying dictators and despots, and that's what I spent most of the last 10 years doing. And then somewhere I started to realize that these personalities, these types of people that I was encountering in that line of work, were also in boardrooms and mid-level management and neighborhood associations. And so I wanted to do a sort of 360-degree assessment of power and who seeks it, who gets it, how it changes people. So I started doing a deep dive, not just with 500 interviews with people who really, most of them shouldn't have been in power, but also by bringing in insights from a variety of disciplines, not just political science, my own discipline, but also behavioral economics, neuroscience, psychology, evolutionary biology, trying to figure out what makes these people tick and how we can reform the systems to make this work much better for all of us.
Yeah, and that's one of the things about this book that made it so interesting is the incredibly broad and deep look you take. You know, you, as you just mentioned, you approach the issue from numerous disciplines, some of which I imagine have typically been outside of your purview. So, you know, that helps create a three-dimensional picture of, you know, bad guys who maybe are seen as two-dimensional a lot of times. So before we kind of get into the meat of the book, I just was very curious what initially drew you to this kind of research anyway. You know, what attracts you, if that's even the right word, to interview, as you put it in the book, the mostly bad people who abuse their power to do mostly bad things, often the crazy and the cruel. Why would you want to be in the same room with people who not only don't play by the rules, but don't recognize that rules exist, at least as they apply to themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I've grappled with because, you know, I think that we have an innate fascination with bad people. I mean, you see this with, you know, real true crime podcasts and serial killers and so on. And I encountered this through, you know, war criminals, rebels, and dictators that I met during my research for my PhD. And the thing that really lingered with me in all of those conversations was that these were, as you say, three-dimensional people, right? I mean, the weird thing about it, the really jarring thing, is that you meet or you shake hands with someone or you have breakfast with someone and you know that they have, in one of the instances in the book, they've used live rounds on protesters and they've been responsible for 99 people dying. Or they've been involved in torturing someone. And sometimes you've interviewed the torture victim, as I have in some of these cases. And yet they crack jokes, they're charming, they have families they talk about. And so, you know, I found this very, very strange to reconcile the individual experience of sitting across the table with someone who had been either corrupted by power or who was irredeemably corruptible to begin with, and then the experience of them behaving in seemingly normal ways. And so what I wanted to sort of understand was, is that because of the system they inhabit? Did something change about them? Is it because of the place they grew up in? Or is it just that there's personalities that are like that? And sort of it gets that chicken or the egg question that drives a lot of the research in the book of, is it that power corrupts, or is it that corruptible people seek power? And the answer, as you know, I come to is both, but for different reasons with different people.
Right. And, you know, you use the word charm and, you know, by extrapolation, charisma. And I think, you know, those are terms that we should probably get into later on. But just to sort of frame the discussion, because there's so much to cover. And I imagine that a lot of people here haven't read the book yet, although, of course, they're all going to read it after we're done, because you should. You start in your introduction laying out the 4 questions that kind of drove your research and drove the way in which you organized the material. And I just want to use those as a frame in which to ask questions and make sense of how we're going to move forward. The first is, do worse people get power? The second is, does power make people worse? And that actually reminded me of something President Barack Obama said. The presidency doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. Third, why do we let people control us who clearly have no business being in control? And fourth, and this was my favorite of the four questions, how can we ensure that incorruptible people get into power and wield it justly? So that's sort of the springboard for your book, but I also wanted it to be the springboard for the conversation we're having, so people can keep those questions in mind as we move on. And I was just curious, you touched on this a little bit already, but I was wondering, since you knew who you were dealing with, you knew what these people had done, what they were potentially capable of doing. Were you ever surprised? Like, were there any moments that really took you aback, either because you came in with preconceived notions or they just upended the expectations anybody would have about them?
Yeah, I think, there's two that really stand out to me from the book. One of them is Paul Bremer, who, many people will remember from 2003. He was the person that George W. Bush appointed to basically become the viceroy of Iraq after the invasion. And one of the strangest things I did in researching the book was I took a ski lesson with him, because he's now a ski instructor, believe it or not, in Vermont. So I flew out and I took a ski lesson with him for a while, which was funny because that was my high school sport, was ski racing. So I was already a pretty good skier, but I wanted to talk to him. And we went back to his house and so on. And the thing that's really strange about him is that we talked about how early on in the invasion, he floated the idea of shooting looters, people who had been looting stores in Iraq after the US invaded. And he was widely criticized for this, and I think rightly so. But the thing that was really interesting about how he talked about this was that, he had been the ambassador to Malawi and Norway and several other places, and had served with distinction in those placements. And then he ends up inheriting effectively a dictatorship where he's woken up by, mortar rounds coming at, trying to kill him basically. And Osama bin Laden puts a bounty of 10,000 grams of gold on his head, which I think is the only ski instructor in Vermont that's true for. And, he says, one can only hope. Yeah, one can only hope. And he says to me, look, this was a totally different system. I had to make different judgments here. And I think that really stood out to me as something that's true, right? That you can't take a system like post-Saddam Iraq and simply imagine that we're going to have exactly the same rules as the United States. And so he was trying to deal with that reality. And it forced him to make decisions that I think most people would find morally difficult, if not morally abhorrent, like shooting looters for stealing, TVs and things like that. Yeah. Which of course they didn't do, but he floated the idea as a way to send a message. The other that stood out is I met Ma Anand Sheila, who was the right-hand woman to a cult leader in the 1980s. And she's just the most amazing story of power corrupting, I think, because what she did was she grew up, she was an art student, she gets into this cult, she rises through the ranks, wields enormous power. I mean, power beyond normal politics, because she was the voice of a guru that was the god for these people, and ends up hatching this plot to poison loads of voters in Oregon as a ploy to take over the county that she's in, where there's a risk of her cult being shut down. And, what's amazing about this is I went and I met her in Switzerland, where she now runs a care home for people with schizophrenia and other mental illnesses and so on. And she's the most lovely person in person, right? She poisoned someone with water during her time at the cult. And yet, she's offering me a glass of water. I was a bit hesitant to take it. But it was so odd. She transformed back so much that the state in Switzerland said, you can care for vulnerable people. And she's the worst bioterrorist in American history. She poisoned 1,000 people with salmonella. So what those stories told me is that people are really, really complicated, that power is not just about personality. Power is also about the system and the intersection between the individual, the culture they inhabit, and the system that they're operating in. And that, some people are irredeemable. There's a section in the book there's a section in the book about psychopaths, and many of them, they probably can't behave in normal ways. But for other people, maybe if they were in a better system, maybe if there was better oversight, maybe if they're surrounded by better people, they could actually behave better, which actually makes me very hopeful. So those are the two that really stood out to me as much more complicated than I thought they would be going in.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that's really counterintuitive, I guess, in ways is, you know, I think power is addictive in the way that money is addictive, and yet, as you said, if you take certain kinds of people out of it, they don't crave it again. They adapt to a system in which they don't have the same kind of power. And, you know, even though we could argue that perhaps she shouldn't have been allowed to roam free and take care of vulnerable people, she has adapted. So, you know, at least theoretically, there is hope if we can figure out why that's the case, and, you know, what kinds of people, what kinds of personalities can be redeemed. So just as sort of on a personal level, in reading this, and I agree, I'm fascinated by serial killers. I would never want to be in a room with one, however. Were you ever afraid or worried about your safety? Because I had a visceral reaction to some of this, and not entirely sure I would have, because it felt like you were putting yourself at risk, which may or not be the case. But again, as we said earlier, you know, these are people who not only don't play by rules, they don't think rules apply to them. So was there ever any, you know, you just said did she poison your water, but was there ever any real threat, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the people that I interviewed, the danger would come after when I wrote about them, because they're very powerful people. So you always are sort of aware of that. There were a few encounters in my research where it was the kind of thing that I told my mom after I had gotten home, you know, sort of thing, because I was meeting with rebels and West Africa and sort of taking them at, you know, hoping that they would keep me. This part, these people understand who they're talking to when I talk to them now, that I'm someone who writes for the Washington Post and so on, and that there would be, as one ambassador put it to me in a somewhat, you know, unkind way, he said, "You're a twofer. You're going to upset two governments because you live in the UK and you work and you're from the US, so you're protected that way."
Yeah, well, hopefully, because again, it is really, to put yourself out there, to expose yourself in that way, in the pursuit of information and truth was quite something. I have some more questions, some more broad questions, but I kind of wanted to set up by going into some more specific examples that you write about. I was particularly fascinated by your discussion of the Doraville Police Department training videos, and one in the way in which your discussion of those were a callback to an earlier discussion you had about Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and on the other hand, as a juxtaposition to training videos out of New Zealand. Because it is so important, I think, to understand that the kinds of leaders that we typically think of aren't the only problem. The problem is, as you said earlier, they exist in boardrooms, they exist at the local level, in police departments, in schools, etc. And by trying to understand how that happens, like how that's allowed to go on, and I guess how it is allowed to spread to other people is really worth knowing. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because again, it was just incredibly insightful and eye-opening.
Yeah, so the early chapter starts with the Stanford prison experiment, but it sort of flips it on its head, because the Stanford prison experiment, as most people know, suggests that if you put a uniform on a college student and you tell them they're a prison guard, they start abusing people very quickly. And what I actually found was there was a study that hasn't gotten very much attention several decades later, where they replicated the Stanford prison experiment ad the recruitment ad, but they just changed the word from for a prison experiment or for a study of prison life to for a psychology study. And what happened was when they tested the recruits who came to the for a prison ad versus the recruits who came for the generic psychology study, the recruits who showed up for the prison experiment were much more Machiavellian, abusive, authoritarian, had scores that were higher on psychopathy. They were more psychopathic. So the point was that the ad actually had a self-selection effect. And so perhaps it's not that the guards were putting on the uniform and becoming abusive. Perhaps it was that abusive people responded to an ad where they got to dress up as guards. And so I took that insight and thought about how that applies for things like the police departments in the United States, where a lot of the very important police reform debates that are happening on the level of what the police do. It's thinking about how do we reform the system so that police behave better, or we have marginal improvements so that abusive people don't act as abusively. I think we need to think a lot more about who the police are and who's self-selecting into the badge and the gun. So Doraville had a recruitment video on its website that was, I mean, it's the most absurd thing I've ever seen. It's effectively a town right outside of Atlanta, 10,000 people, and they've got effectively what's a tank, and these SWAT team members in camouflage fatigues who look like soldiers, drive around in this tank. They flash logos of the Punisher, which is, a vigilante who takes things into his own hands and takes justice into his own hands and uses abuse to punish criminals and torture them. And they've got that logo alongside the tank and the guns and the grenades. And I just thought to myself, if you're like a normal person who just wants to serve your community and you watch that ad, are you going to apply for the Doraville PD? The answer is obviously no. But if you're militaristic and abusive and you have a itchy trigger finger, you're going to say, sign me up. Right. So New Zealand recognized that. They said, we know that power holds a certain magnetism to a certain kind of people. So we're going to try to counteract that. And what they did was they came up with this series of comedic videos that basically aimed at recruiting people who didn't want to be cops in the first place, people who aren't drawn to the badge and the gun. And the effects were extremely positive. They had a much more diverse police force. They had underrepresented minorities were applying in droves, and many more women applied to be cops as well, which created better outreach to the community because there was a better demographic match between people in the police and the people they were policing. So one of the key points I try to make throughout the book is that you have to design systems in a way that counteracts that obvious aspect of power that draws in corruptible people, that is magnetic to the bad apples, because it's easier to recruit good apples than it is to make bad apples behave well.
Yeah, and that was such a great point. You also made it clear that if you the only tool you have is a hammer, you're going to see everything as a nail. And we're set. It's such a crucial point in this country in terms of the need for police reform. Don't get me wrong, obviously we've needed it for a long time, but I think more people are aware in ways they maybe hadn't been in the past. And by people, I mean white people, generally speaking, because of not the increase certainly in prevalence, but the increase in visibility, culminating with Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd. And, in that discussion, as you just said, what gets lost is how do we train people properly? Not how do we retrain people, but also all of that's happening in the context of the increased militarization of the police. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, because it's shocking what kinds of armor and weaponry a police department, even rural police departments, have at their disposal. And what does that do to the idea of serve and protect when you see your fellow citizens always as potential adversaries?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think the big point here is that people who have a military background, many of them have skills that are absolutely perfect for policing if they're in roles like the SWAT team. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of people who are community patrol officers who were deployed to Fallujah, and then they come home to Ferguson, and they can't necessarily differentiate between the two types of training they've received. And so the militarization point comes in where the US military basically had surplus weapons that they wanted to get rid of. And the idea was, let's give them at a discount rate or for free to police departments. So they have these, as you say, toys at their disposal to play with. And the absurdity in researching this was amazing, because there was one sheriff's department that I found in Indiana where they had an amphibious assault vehicle, and the only piece of water in the entire county was a small pond next to a farmhouse. So they weren't exactly
Isn't
about
the
to use
entire
them.
state landlocked? Last I checked.
Yeah, I mean, it's so exactly. So the point though is that if you're in a department where you have all these things, you're going to think, we might as well use them. And so what research showed when people analyzed this statistically was that the departments with higher levels of violence wanted the military equipment more. And then when they got it, they also were more likely to kill people than other departments that didn't have the gear. So I think this speaks to a broader point, right? Because of course, I already highlighted the self-selection that power can have, where people who are drawn to policing for the wrong reasons are more likely to put their hat in the ring. But also once you get there, there's a culture around you that can make a good apple turn bad. And so, it's not like you can solve one problem and then it's fixed. It's that you have to think about these things at every stage. So you have to assume that people who are drawn to power for the wrong reasons will try to seek power more than good, decent people. People who are drawn to power for the wrong reasons are going to be better at getting power than normal, decent people, and they're going to be better at staying in power. And so once you accept that reality, then you redesign the system to block those people from getting into positions of authority, and you try to weed them out and find ways to screen them so that they can't do as much damage as they otherwise would.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really interesting is, the culture of violence that is essentially encouraged sometimes is borne out. There are fascinating data that show that in counties, particularly in the Black Belt in the South, where the most lynchings occurred, decades later is where the most police shootings of Black people are. I mean, it's just incredible. So, we know that these aren't isolated incidents. They really take root if we allow them to. So I kind of, in a little bit, I want to go broader, but right now I'd like to focus in even a little bit more, make the circle smaller and talk about family. Because I guess you could say that this is where everything starts, right? I mean, I don't have any personal experience of this kind of thing at all, but apparently family members are often the first to notice that a person who will later prove to be a menace to society and gains power has had that potential for a very long time. So what can we do as, I guess, without turning into the kids in 1984, what can we do without alienating people to diffuse a situation before, and I'm told this can happen before it gets completely out of hand and the worst among us get power and seem to do everything.
It's an excellent question. And I think this is where we need to have fewer silos when it comes to power, because one of the things that happens is that somebody who occupies a position of power is often seen as being only that figure in that context. There's not a whole sort of canvas of who they are in the rest of their life. And I think it's a real problem. I think we need to humanize people who are in power. We need to understand that they have different traits and different roles and so on. And I also think it's important, by the way, that people who end up in positions of power think about the people who are below them, the ones who are affected by their decisions, as though they're family members, as though they're people who are really important to them. I talk in the book about the weight of responsibility problem that comes up. And I think this cuts both ways, both from family members and from people who are in power, which is to say that when you're in a position of authority, it's very easy to start developing a view of the people below you as abstractions, right? On a very basic level, this is part of the reason why you might know your boss's birthday, but your boss might not know your birthday, right? You start to be less important to the person above you in the hierarchy. But if that gets out of hand, if you're the faraway CEO or the person in charge of a country who rarely interacts with voters who disagree with them, you start to see the people who are affected by your decisions as complete abstractions. And this leads to abuse. And so I think one of the things that's really important is trying to hit home that weight of responsibility. And so in this section of the book, what I talk about is Ken Feinberg, who was one of the people who dealt with the 9/11 Victims Compensation Fund, of trying to decide what a person's life was worth, one of the hardest decisions somebody can make. And then I juxtapose that with John Yoo, who was one of the people who was responsible for deciding what sort of enhanced interrogation or torture methods would be acceptable for the US military after September 11th. And what's really interesting to me in talking to them is that, Feinberg met with all the victims. He went face to face with them. They were not abstractions. He heard their story, he understood their plight, and he then decided on the dollar amount to give them. And when I talked to John Yoo, the thing that was really, it speaks to your question before of the sort of jarring experience I wasn't expecting. I thought he would talk about how hard it was to write that memo. And instead, he sort of said to me, I didn't lose any sleep over it. It wasn't really that difficult of a question. It was just a legal question. And I was like, this was something where detainees were getting subjected to treatment that at least a certain segment of the population, myself included, would consider torture. And he says, it was a strictly legal question. And that I pressed him on it. I kept saying, but didn't you sort of reflect on what it would be like to be on the other side? And he said, not really. And so I think that's the point where, we need to have these interactions between people in power and those who are affected. And they also need to be reminded by their family members that the weight of responsibility they have is a tremendous responsibility, and one that they need to wield with justice and compassion and empathy. And that's where I think the people around us, even if we end up in a position of power, the people around us can stop us from behaving badly. It's not just incumbent on accountability and oversight. It's also incumbent on all of us to call out abuses of power when we see them.
Yeah, and one of the problems I imagine with this sort of pseudo academic detached decisions somebody like John Yoo would make is that it entirely elides the experience of the would-be torturer. And then we have another entirely new problem on our hands, because what happens to that individual, either psychologically, that if that person isn't prepared, that's traumatic. It introduces him or her to an entirely new kind of behavior that would normally be entirely outside of the purview of normal human experience. So, again, I think that creates a whole new set of issues. And I think we see how that plays out in police departments and, other situations in which there are petty tyrants, whether it's a homeowners association or a condo board, right? So I'd like to ask you, because this is something that's been on my mind and a lot of people's minds for quite some time now. What do you, looking at it through the context of your expertise, what do you make of America's current political crisis? Given Donald Trump's ascension to power and his seeming lack of interest, this unshakable hold on power that is, being enabled by the Republican Party, and his entire, his complete unwillingness to give it up. How do we make sense of this? Because I think for a lot of people, it's new in the experience of how the American government is supposed to work.
Yeah, I think Trump is emblematic. Donald Trump is emblematic, I should say, of a reflection of a big question that I do deal with in the book, which is, why are we drawn to certain people as our leaders? And this is something that I think is very interesting, because people get divided on this question for very different reasons. What do they see in that figure in particular that is a strong leader or is an abhorrent leader? And the fact that there's a divide there is really interesting, because it suggests that actually the cognitive processes by which we choose leaders are not all the same. right? We're not all thinking about this in the same way.
Right.
And so there's a study I talk about in the opening section of the book that's really, really stuck with me when I read it the first time, where children were shown faces on a screen. They got two faces. And they said, pick the person that you believe should captain your imaginary ship in this computer game. And what was amazing was that they didn't realize, the kids weren't told, that the faces they saw were the winner of a French election and the runner-up in the French election. And most of the time, the kids picked the winner as the captain of their ship. And when they reran the study as adults, with adults, the same thing happened. And so it leads to this conclusion, which is we're making assessments at face value, quite literally, for leaders. And some of us.
These were very, very young children, right?
Yes, exactly. Very young. I believe they're 5 or 6 years old, and already they were making judgments about what they saw as a leader, which suggests there's templates in our brains that suggest certain types of people appear to be more leader-like to us. Whether that's learned or innate is a very difficult question to untangle. But I also think, when you ask about the dysfunction in US politics, I think, what I'm really worried about is that we've made power, in this sort of political sense, toxic to normal people. In other words, if you're somebody who's in your local community and you're thinking, I'd really like to make my child's school district behave just a little bit better, I'd like to make it better for the other kids. And then you turn on the TV and you see that school board members are receiving death threats. They're getting harassed outside their homes, right? Those people who are normal, decent community servants are going to say, it's just not worth it. Because while somebody who's drawn to power will think, all right, I'll put up with that because I'll get the power in the end, the person who doesn't care about power will think, okay, the cost is enormous, death threats, harassment, my children being in the spotlight, et cetera. But the benefit is very small, right? The benefit is for the person who's actually drawn by the good reasons. So what I'm really, really worried about is the pipeline of future leaders we have coming into this country, into the United States, which is to say, who wants to be a public servant when public service looks toxic? And I've seen the extreme of that in places like Thailand, where you go into politics and you lose everything. If you upset the wrong person, you end up in jail, your fortune is wiped out, you could get killed. And so when I talk to young people who are, going to top schools, really, really bright young people, they said politics is where, the psychopaths go and the people who are willing to roll the dice and see if they're going to lose everything. I'm going to go into business. And, of course there's a place for people to go into business, but you want people to aspire to public service. And so I think that there's this self-selection problem that we're really going to face the consequences of unless we can dial down the violent extremism and rhetoric that is making it appear to be toxic to want to serve your community.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to my next question, but I did just really quickly want to go back to something you said about, what people see in leaders, because one of the things I grappled with for really, I was trying to be objective. What do people see in Donald? Clearly, I'm missing something. I've known this person my entire life. They must see something in him. I don't. What is it? And then I realized that we're using a completely different frame of reference. The things I revile in him, they admire, so I think that's incredibly important in order not simply to make sense of, but to sort of maybe make inroads into what's happening with people who have vastly different experiences from your own, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think, one of the things that is, it's in the book and I talk about is how, there's a variety of reasons why people like Donald Trump. There's a variety of reasons why people vote for him and so on. And I don't explore those in the book. And actually his name does not appear in Corruptible by design, but
I was very, very pleased to see that, by the way.
But the point is that, there are templates. One of the things I talked to a lot of evolutionary psychologists who basically said to me, look, our brains have not significantly changed for the last 200,000 years as a physical structure. In other words, we basically have the same brains that people in the distant past had. but they had very different lives than us. They had hunter-gatherer lives. They had threats from predators. They had all sorts of things that we just don't think about when we're, shopping in the supermarket and so on. And so the templates that can get activated for that are very interesting. And one of the ones that they talked about, which some people would suggest references someone like Donald Trump, is that in times of crisis, in times of uncertainty, that large, physically imposing men are very appealing to people. And that when those people portray a sense of crisis, or as Donald Trump talked about in his inauguration speech, American carnage, that activates that sort of impulse a little bit more, that it sort of makes us think we do need to turn to the physically large person the same way that our hunter-gatherer ancestors might have. And whether you agree with that or disagree with that, whether you think Donald Trump is great or awful, the underlying point is what's important, which is that there are things that are happening when we think about whether somebody makes a good or bad leader that are not necessarily rational and are not necessarily conscious. And I think that's the crucial point that I try to highlight in the book, which is to say, when you think about why we're picking leaders, we have to reflect a bit more. If that study about children picking leaders to captain their imaginary ship holds water, and if there's aspects of our evolutionary anthropology and psychology that are playing a role, maybe it's not just the policies. There's other things that are happening. And somebody like Vladimir Putin is well aware of this, which is why he's constantly photographed shirtless, sort of in the wilderness to show his show of strength. One of the lines I have in the book is I say, imagine this in any other sort of capacity in your life, somebody taking off their shirt to show their physical prowess for a job they're going to do. I mean, a dentist who does this before he cleans your teeth, you're going to report them to the licensing board and get a different dentist. But, for some political leaders, it's very important to show that physical domination. And I think that does speak to the fact that some of us are persuaded by it.
Yeah, and that double standard is obviously it isn't new, but I think it's taken a lot of us by surprise. Donald, for example, just because he's the person who's right in front of us, with whom we still have to be dealing at the moment, he wouldn't get a job anywhere. He wouldn't get a job at a Fortune 500 company. He wouldn't get a job at a 7-Eleven, probably. So it's just extraordinary how exceptions are made, allowances are made. And that brings me to what will probably be our last question before we get to the Q&A. And again, this goes back to what you were saying earlier about what attracts people to leadership, what turns people off. So we currently seem to be living in a time where, on the one side, we have people who are willing to push the envelope. They're willing to cheat, lie, steal. They're willing to talk about burning books, and they're willing to attack Muppets, even because they think that is their best their best path to accruing more power. On the other side, we have a lot of people who seem to have a compulsion to hold the line, to color within the lines, to follow the rules, even if doing so will almost ensure that they lose power. So you've done a really good job of explaining that, but how do we fight against this increasingly prevalent phenomenon?
Yeah, I think the real challenge is, how do you deal with people who are going to lie and cheat and steal in any sort of system of authority? And the problem is, and this is one of the things I highlight later on in the book, about why sometimes power appears to corrupt people when that's actually not what's happening, is something called the dirty hands problem, which is sometimes to fight fire with fire, you end up getting your hands dirty. And so you look like you've become worse over time, even though you've been trying to maintain your principles in the face of somebody who's willing to subvert them or avoid them. And so, there's an example that I talk about in the book of Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, our exemplar of the best president. And, there's some suggestions in the historical record that to get some of his key legislative accomplishments across the line, including, ending slavery and things like that there were some political deals made that probably weren't totally above board.
Yeah.
And I'm super glad he did them. And I think that's one of the things that you have to recognize is that there are very few people who are able to operate in a pristine system where they have the luxury of always, always, always doing the right thing. And I want us to live in a world where that's true. But I think we have to also measure up our people who are in positions of leadership around the constraints that they face, to understand that sometimes when people in positions of power do bad things, it's because they're bad people. But other times it's because they're in bad systems. And the reason why that's so important is because the solution is different, right? If the bad person is a bad person, it's harder to fix them. If the bad person is actually a bad system, it's way easier to fix that. And so, I think the misdiagnosis problem is so important, where this is an issue in American politics as well. You have to think about what is a systemic problem that needs reform and what is the individual. And I think that's the big debate that we're having as a country right now, is what needs to be reformed and what's about the people who need to lose elections.
Yeah. And you're saying that, this is a little, I don't think it's off topic, but it's not an American example, but it does remind me of systems that entrap weaker people. I'm thinking specifically of the Magdalen laundries in Ireland, and how the nuns became their own, dictatorial, and committed the most horrible atrocities against people even less powerful than they were. So I think it's probably likely true that most of them weren't awful people. It was the system. So, it seems to be a universal problem. Okay, so I want to turn to our questions. First is, do you have any thoughts about some nurses and elementary school teachers in the context of power dynamics and systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a general question, but I'm generally in favor of nurses and elementary school teachers, and I think they're generally very good people. I think one of the things that's worth pointing out here, and I should have said much earlier, is there are tons of people in positions of power who are good and decent people. And the reason why I focus so much on the bad apples are significantly probably overrepresented in the book is because they do disproportionate damage. So I think you have issues that you have to think about with professions, where what kind of profession is most likely to be represented in the abusive aspects of power. I think on that list would be nurses and elementary school teachers. But of course, you do occasionally have bad apples, and the important thing is to simply weed them out. But yeah, I think those are basically the extent of my thoughts on that topic.
Okay. From Monty, the eminent biographer Robert Caro says power reveals, suggesting preordained metrics in power aggrandizement in use. I'm sorry, power. What are your thoughts? I think there's a word missing here, but suggesting preordained metrics in power aggrandizement. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I went back and forth on this a lot during my thinking on the book. The sort of power attracts, power corrupts, power reveals dynamics here. And I think in different situations, they're all true. It depends on who you're talking about, what the system is, the individual context. What I will say that I think is really interesting is that people who are in positions of power can sometimes appear to be much worse the longer they're in, partly because they get worse, because power does corrupt. I have a whole chapter talking about all the psychological research that shows that this is true. But also there could be other things happening. So let's imagine you have a totally rotten person. You have a psychopath, and the psychopath gets into either a senior level of the corporate hierarchy or becomes a dictator. Now, when they first start in that job, they're going to be the same psychopath they always were, but they're not going to know the system very well. They're not going to know the tricks of the trade. The longer they stay in that position of power, the better they're going to get at wielding it and abusing it. And so on paper, they're going to be looking like they're worse, right? Because they're going to be more effective at being bad. So right. If you sort of quantified it, they would do more bad things. Is that because they became worse? I would say no. I think it's because they learned how to be effective at abuse. And so one of the things that I learned in researching this book is every time you sort of peel back these sayings that are sort of, cocktail conversation, like power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, there's actually a much more complicated picture that's happening. And that's, where I try to explore the nuance in these various chapters.
Yeah, that's it. It is an amazing analysis. So again, everybody needs to get and read this book. The next question actually is touches on something I didn't get to ask you, or at least half of it, because you do touch on race and gender quite a bit. So this question is about gender. And it just disappeared. Hang on a second. Okay. Oh, here we go. It moved up to the top. Can you speak to gender issues and the notions of masculinity being captured by certain memes and pressure? This is an old idea, but how does it play out? Because there does seem to be this enormous disparity between men and women and white men and men of color.
Yeah, so these are both huge parts of the book, right? Because one of the things that I try to explain is that a lot of the discourse around power has what I call the tip of the iceberg problem, which is to say we focus on what we can see, which are the people in power. What we're not focusing enough on is who's below the surface that never got there. And there are systematic biases that are at play here. The gender one, I think, is really interesting because when people do try to study how women wield power differently from men, the results are universally positive, right? They're very less prone to despotism, less prone to abuse, less prone to taking bribes, all sorts of good stuff that shows up in the research. Now, I'm very cautious about that because I think it's dangerous to be a gender essentialist where you say men are good at some things and women are good at some things. I don't subscribe to that. So I represent and put that research forward, but I sort of put that caveat there. Yeah. But what we do know, and what I think is the most persuasive case here, is that the systems in most places are disproportionately biased against women. So one of the great studies that I talk about is where they ask faculty members to assess someone who's applying for a job in a science lab. And what they did was they had all these different, fake resumes, fake CVs, and they randomly assigned a male name or a female name. That was the only thing that changed. Everything else was identical on these different CVs. And what they found across the board was that the woman name was less likely to be hired. The female name was less likely to be hired. And on top of that, they were likely to be offered a lower starting salary than a person who had a male name with the exact same qualifications. This was totally blind. It was randomized. And the depressing thing, the thing that I found also a really interesting wrinkle here was that it didn't matter whether the faculty member who was reading this was a man or a woman. They both behaved this way. And so, I think there's something that's really profound about that study that says, you can talk about gender bias and racial bias. And by the way, the same study exists with race, and the same results show up with job applications where people who have identical CVs but have a African-American sounding name versus a white sounding name, totally different callback rates for interviews and for hiring and so on. And I think that's where we really need to think about what is skewed about our hiring, promotion, and other procedures. And I also think, the representation question is important here. Yeah. If you are applying to be in a company and all the people above you are white men and you're not, you're going to start to think maybe this isn't the place where I can get ahead. Right. So there's a lot of research that shows that, for example, people who are trying to rise through a corporate hierarchy that's very, very white and male at the top. What's one of the phrases I love from some of the research is the snowy peaks or the vanilla boys problem. They suggest that a lot of people who are talented, who are from different demographics, will opt out of those companies and join smaller outfits where they think they can be noticed as an individual. And that compounds the problem, right? Because then you have talented people who are not like the people at the top of the company, who are basically self-selecting out of the company, making the problem worse. So you need to have representation, but you also need to have a real rethink of how we do hiring decisions, where maybe it should be blind, right? I mean, there's no reason why you need to know the name of the person applying for a job in a large company. And I think that the qualifications need to speak for themselves. I find this in my own work where, as a professor, I grade people and it's anonymous. And I'm very happy about that. It's a part of the British system that's not universally used in the US. And I'm really happy about it because whether I like or dislike a student, whether I have any sort of implicit or subconscious biases, they're eliminated because all I can see is a number on the top of the page. And I think the more that we have that in hiring and promotion decisions, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant because in the context of teachers and students, there is a social aspect. You know them as human beings too. So that's fascinating. And we do at any opportunity, there's so much implicit bias, and it reminds us of what we were talking about earlier, those police training videos, that in Doraville, the likelihood that a person of color or a woman was going to apply for their jobs was vanishingly small. And that actually does give me hope, because so much of this does seem reparable. There do seem to be steps that can be taken if we only had the willingness, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of this just seems to be a failure of imagination.
I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, that's the thing that I found in the last third of the book. I have 10 different principles for how to fix this, how to turn this all around and make things better. And the thing is, they're ideas that are not rocket science. They're not super, super complicated. It's just that we haven't thought about this from this perspective. It's, as I said, it's that tip of the iceberg problem. You have to think about, how do you redesign the system to make it so it's fairer, so it attracts better people? But you have to actually think about it. And I think a lot of the time we're on autopilot. We just sort of think this is the way it was done before. This is the way it's going to be done again.
Exactly.
And replicating those systems is not helpful. So, in my opinion, many, many more organizations for which abuse of power is a problem need to think about redesigning their hiring, their recruitment, their promotion systems in ways that are not, designed to elevate one type of person over another. They're just supposed to make sure that the person is applying for the right reasons, that they're qualified, that all these things are actually taken into consideration. Because, we talked about psychopaths earlier. What is the ideal way for a psychopath to operate? It's in a job interview. I mean, job interviews are all about charm and making people like you. Psychopaths are known for being extremely charming, at least on a superficial level. Right. So, we have to think about that. Introverts are less good at job interviews. Are they less good at jobs? No. So, there are certain things that have become the default for how we decide who's in power, and we have to reflect on them a bit more. That's, I think, one of the key takeaways that I argue in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. But before that, I want to read your dedication. One, because I love it. It's one of the best dedications I've ever seen, and it's also related to the question. To all the nice non-psychopaths out there who should be in power but aren't, and that reminds me of the fourth question you open the book with. How can we ensure that incorruptible people get into power and wield it justly? And the question from Monty is, how can others inspire without themselves being seduced by power? And that, to me, seems to be an incredibly important question to answer, because are there enough totally incorruptible people?
I'm actually, it's funny because I spent a lot of my career dealing with awful people, but I'm extremely optimistic, and I generally believe that human nature is very good. So I'm very optimistic about this. And I do think there are plenty of incorruptible people out there who would make great leaders. This is part of the reason why I wrote the book, by the way, because all of us on this call probably think about their friends and family, and they think they're wonderful people who would make great leaders. And a lot of us also think the people who are in charge are terrible, right? So there's a juxtaposition there between our lived experience and who's actually getting power. Now, how do we get people to behave better? I think one of those, as I said, there's 10 aspects that I talk about in the book, but I'll just talk about one briefly. So rotation, it's a very simple idea, but it works very, very well. So for example, banks that are worried about embezzlement will sometimes ask employees who are key to take 2-week vacations so they can spot the embezzlement. Police departments in the UK will rotate partners, because the more trust you have in your partner, the more that you have this sort of idea that you've got your back, I've got your back and you've got mine, even if we're going to behave in corrupt or abusive ways, the more you're going to collude together.
Right.
And so rotation is this very simple idea that's super, super powerful. And there's psychology studies that back this up as well, where you give people a game and you say, there's many different strategies for how to win it. One of them is cheating. And when you have people in the same pair for the entire game, a lot of them cheat. But when you rotate partners, very few of them cheat. And this is true whether you do the study in China or Germany or other places. It's part of human nature. So, I think that there are things we can do. This is not a pessimistic book. It has awful people as characters in it, but the final takeaways from the book are actually, we can fix this, and it's not that hard. It's just we have to really make an effort, because we are being failed by our leaders right now, and a better future with more incorruptible people in charge of our lives is certainly possible.
Yeah, and honestly, that was one of the enlightening and pleasantly surprising things about this. It is not pessimistic, despite the cast of characters. It is quite hopeful. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I could talk to you for days about this, but I just want to bring Chelsea back in. And Brian, thank you so much for talking with me and for writing this incredible book that seriously, everybody should read this. I learned so much, and it did give me hope in pretty dark times. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Brian Klaas and Marielle Trump, and all of you for joining us this evening. Your patronage is what enables us to host such wonderful programming like this. As a gentle reminder, I've put the link in the chat to purchase Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. It'll take you directly to the Politics and Prose website, where you can also check out our events page. We hope to see you at another event soon. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. Thank you both. Such a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.